So today I am joined by Johnbosco Nwogbo, who is from the anti-privatisation campaign group We Own It. We're going to be having an extensive discussion about the Labour government's record on public services. They've been in office for 2 years now. What have they achieved? What have they got right? What have they got wrong? And we're also going to be talking about what the next Prime Minister of Great Britain, we assume Andy Burnham, should do differently on public services as well. The way it's going to work is I'm going to be sort of interviewing Johnbosco over the next bit of your lives, but there'll be opportunities for you to also send questions in for me to put to Johnbosco as well. So if you have any questions that you want me to ask, pop them in the chat. If you're stirred or inspired to ask anything, then please do pop them in the chat, and I'll do my best to put them to Johnbosco. So without further ado, we'll get going. So firstly, a massive thank you, Johnbosco, for joining us this evening. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, or as well as one can do in this heat. But I feel very privileged to be um, feeling comfortable enough to be able to be here. So thank you so much for having us, and of course, I hope everyone else is holding up at home.
Thanks, John Bosco. And yep, I am in an absolutely sweltering, tiny little room. So if my brain at any points fades, I will blame it entirely on the climate emergency rather than on my own inability to pull together my thoughts. So the way we're going to have this conversation is we're going to look at public services in the UK in a sort of we're going to look at some of them one by one. We're going to start with the NHS because it's one of the issues that the British public care most about.
Mm.
It's fundamental to ordinary people with their healthcare, and it's also an area that the Labour government has talked quite extensively talked up its record on. So when the Labour government came to office, it was sort of 2 years after the COVID crisis. We had massive waiting lists. We had, ambulances queuing outside of hospitals because there weren't enough beds. We had staff taking industrial action. And Keir Starmer and the then Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, have really talked up their successes on the NHS, on bringing down waiting lists, on investments, on staffing. John Bosco, what do you make of their record on the NHS over the last 2 years?
No, I think that's a really, really good place to start. I wanted to, if you don't mind, start by saying a little bit about kind of the background for why the NHS is so important. And obviously, people often try and, especially people on the right of British politics, who either those who take money from private healthcare companies or other kinds of interests that are relevant to the area, often suggest that we would be better off with private health insurance or private healthcare. So it's always really important to remind people of two things. The NHS is what we created because we wanted to get away from what those people want to take us back to. There was a time in British history when the level of access that you have to healthcare depends very much, or depended very much, on whether or not you're able to pay for it, or if you're lucky enough, whether or not somebody else is willing to provide you charity for it. So it's really important that people understand that we've gotten away from it, but there is nothing that says we can't go back to it. As a matter of fact, since we got away from it, the Conservatives who voted against it at the beginning have consistently voted or done things in government to undermine it. And now, of course, the Labour government is doing the same. So that's the first thing I wanted people to keep in mind. The second thing, of course, is that the public still overwhelmingly supports healthcare that is provided free at the point of need completely by the public sector, so no private companies, because we believe, the public believes, that your health should be dependent, or the kind of health service you get, the health care you get, should be dependent not on your ability to pay, but on the amount of need you have. And we are able to sit here, although it is extremely hot today, but we are able to sit here and look at our friends in the US who have 40,000 people dying every year because they don't have access to basic healthcare, or who have 500,000 households going bankrupt every year because one of the members of the family had an accident or had cancer. And we're able to sit here and say, oh, at least we're not them. well, we could very easily be them if we do not fight for this thing that we have. So coming back to your question now, what has the government done? What's been the government's record on the NHS? I would say that usually on a bunch of the things that we're going to talk about today, I could highlight one or two good things that the government has done, but also, of course, highlight the things that they need to be doing better on. I would say that on the NHS, there's been basically nothing that they have done well, that they've done right. So I'm going to talk to you about a few things, a few ways that you can see how badly the government has been doing on the NHS. The first thing to keep in mind with respect to the NHS, NHS privatization specifically, is that as of the end of 2025, when after about 6 months of Labour being in government, the NHS had used the private sector for operations more than 500,000 times more in 2025 than they did in 2024. So the Labour government used the private sector more than the Conservative government did, which is obviously somewhat kind of counterintuitive. But the reality is that this government has been far worse in terms of privatizing the NHS than the Conservatives ever were. And that's somewhat understandable, right? The public was extremely suspicious of the Conservatives when they were in government, and therefore the Conservatives moved much more carefully. The Labour government feels that they can speak with one kind of tongue, saying with West Streeting, for example, saying to the New Statesman, I'm not going to privatize the NHS over my dead body, while on the other hand, expanding privatization in the NHS. The Center for Health and the Public Interest recently published research 2 months ago that showed that the private sector had made about £2 billion in profits from providing NHS services over the last few years, just the last few years. That is money that could have gone into hiring new doctors, hiring new nurses, building new NHS laboratories or places where we could treat NHS patients. We are dealing with thousands of people being treated in the corridors while the private sector is able to extract billions from profits in the NHS. So that's one area that the government has been horrible in the NHS. And obviously, the second area is in terms of hip, knees, hernia, and cataracts operations. The private sector now does more of those operations, those kind of basic operations, than the NHS does. And obviously, the vast majority of those operations are actually paid for by the NHS, but they're done by the private sector. And this particular area has some unique problems to private companies running services in them. Just for example, the amount of private companies providing these services, so hip, knees, hernia, and cataracts, has increased by over 400% since 2019. And what are these new companies? They're private equity backed companies. So a private equity company is going to essentially pay somebody £60,000 to open a cataracts kind of surgery center. And all they need to do to get NHS patients is to get a contract from one NHS body in one area. So they may get a contract in Oxford, and that allows them to open a surgery in Wolverhampton or in London. And essentially, once they exist, the NHS almost has no choice but to pay for the care people get from there. So a person can just walk through those doors and say, I have a problem with my eyes, I would like to look at my eyes. And what happens? They kind of carry out some tests on their eyes. And what we know for sure happens is that in a lot of these places, people who should not be getting cataracts operations, some of them because it's not advanced enough yet to warrant an operation, some of them because an operation would not actually necessarily improve their eyesight, are getting cataracts operations from these places because they stand to make a great deal of money. So the government has essentially set this entire sector on fire, if you like, set it on fire in the sense of exploding it. And these people have a lot more kind of confidence now that the government is on their side, and so we're seeing more and more of these kinds of um, operators show up in the sector. And lastly, I just wanted to point out that the government, after the Tories banned PFI in 2018, this government is planning on bringing them back for building neighborhood health centers um, in the NHS. And I don't think I need to explain to anybody how badly PFI has worked out for the NHS. We we have had to pay out around 80 billion pounds for facilities worth around 10 billion pounds that we received from the private sector. And what the government is trying to do is put the NHS further and further into debt by returning PFI to the NHS. They're not calling it PFI, and they're doing everything they can to obscure the fact that it's actually PFI, but they're promising to bring it back. We campaigned strongly against it before the budget in November last year, and thankfully now West Streeting has left, but they've not said they're kind of ditching it yet. And hopefully Andy Burnham can finally put the nails in that coffin and say, all right, we're not going back to that disastrous policy that has cost the NHS hundreds of millions of pounds of money that should instead be going to treat patients, going out in profits for PFI companies.
So we'll come on to Andy Burnham and what he should do next a little later on. But before that, I wanted to just reflecting on what you've sort of said there, and you paint a pretty bleak picture of the government's record on the NHS. Definitely a very different picture than the one that the government itself has tried to portray. But I think a lot of the conversation about the NHS and about privatisation in the mainstream political debate and in the media tends to be around basically paying for healthcare. And people have the idea of the US healthcare model or other healthcare models where people have to pay for healthcare. And the argument often put is that, well, it's fine to have private involvement in the NHS. The problem is just it's fine to have private involvement in the NHS, provided that the health service remains a service that is free at the point of use, free at the point of delivery. People don't have to, pay a bill when they get treated. But your argument is that privatisation private involvement in the NHS more broadly is a problem, and that the idea of privatisation isn't just the idea that you're paying for private health insurance. So I wondered if you could delve a little further into what privatisation as a whole is doing to the NHS and why it's much more than just the idea that you have to pay to see your GP.
Oh, that's a really, really important question that I did not go into in my initial remarks. So there are a number of ways that you can kind of find the problem with privatization, and that I kind of unravel the fallacy of that claim that it doesn't really matter insofar as the care is private, is free at the point of use. I've already highlighted, of course, the fact that in a lot of these private cataracts, knee, hip, and hernia facilities, they are providing surgeries to people who don't really need them. They're essentially also selecting just the people that they could provide those simple operations to without the need for kind of follow-up services. The NHS, if you're being treated by the NHS doesn't just give you the surgery, it needs to continue, and it does continue following up with you to make sure that everything is taking and holding on well. What happens with the private sector is that they provide you this surgery. Whatever happens to you afterwards is basically your problem with the NHS, right? There was research recently that showed that about 20 or so percent of people who received surgeries from the private sector then had to be rushed back to the NHS because they developed some complications from their surgeries. So that's one way that it makes a difference that the service is provided in the NHS and not in the private sector. Now, there is also another element to this where people go to the private hospitals for surgery, but as soon as they develop a complication while they're in the private hospital, they're rushed back to the NHS. And we've actually seen a lot of people, well, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but we know of a good many cases where people have actually died in the process of being transferred from private hospitals back into the NHS, right? Private hospitals don't have emergency facilities, for example. So if let's say you're going there to get I don't know, an example of a surgery. Let's say you're just going to get a mole on your skin removed, right? And you developed sepsis, maybe because there was some carelessness with respect to germs during the operation. The private sector is going to put you in an ambulance or in a vehicle and take you to an NHS hospital. They don't have the facilities to treat you there, right? So in effect, they are kind of privatizing the profits because they still stand to make the profit from treating that patient initially, whether that patient was paid for by the NHS or whether that person paid privately. But if there is a cost, they socialize that cost. That cost goes back to the NHS. And obviously, we know that that happens with a whole bunch of other public services. And this is evidence that it also happens with the NHS. And lastly, something that's really important for people to keep in mind is if we continue down the road of privatization, there will come a time when we will not have enough doctors to provide healthcare in the UK. And obviously, we are dealing right now with doctors, whether they're junior doctors or associate doctors, or now with senior consultants going on strike. The reason that they're going on strike is that their pay is not competitive with the pay of similar doctors in the rest of the world. And a lot of them kind of accept the pay that they get because they view the NHS as something more than like a place to work and like a market situation, right? They view the NHS as an important vocation. That doesn't mean we should not pay them what they deserve. And that's why these doctors are going on strike. Now imagine in a possible future where the NHS no longer does those simple knee operations, those simple hernia operations, those simple cataracts operations, those simple hip operations that they actually use for training doctors. They use those simple operations for training doctors. Those are precisely the operations that are currently being provided by the private sector. And the private sector does not train doctors. Why? Because training doctors is expensive. And the private sector is not going to do anything they don't need to do if it costs money, right? So imagine a future where the NHS cannot train doctors because it's already outsourced the surgeries that it uses to train junior doctors. The private sector does not train doctors because it's expensive. Where are the doctors of the future going to come from? And if we're talking about strikes today, when doctors are asking to be paid more or to be paid more competitively with their colleagues from across the world, how much are they going to be worth in the future when there is even fewer of them? So this is in effect, privatization is in effect setting the NHS on a path down a very, very terrible road that we don't want to go down. Because where it leads is where the US is right now. That's why I made the point to highlight it earlier on. 40,000 people dying from lack of access to basic healthcare. 500,000 households going bankrupt from medical debt. Medical debt is a concept that until recently we were not familiar with here in Britain. But we now are beginning to see some of it, right? People who are in terrible pain because of the waiting lists have to take debt to go privately, right? But we're going to see it expand, explode if the NHS we continue to undermine the NHS in the way that the government is. That's why it's really important that people stand up and fight for the NHS now that we still have it before it's too late.
So I'm going to stick on the NHS for and healthcare more broadly for a couple more questions before I'll move us on to other areas. The first thing I wanted to ask you is, so obviously you've talked a lot about what the Labour government has been doing, but a lot of the reasons why the Labour government has been able to do the things that it's been doing, allowing more private involvement in the NHS as you've described, is because of the way that the NHS has been set up and restructured under the last government, under the Tories. So you have obviously the 2012 Health and Social Care Act under Andrew Lansley, which abolished the Primary Care Trust and set up a new structure for how the NHS would be organised. Then you have the 2022 Health and Care Act under, I think it was Sajid Javid, who was Health Secretary then, which introduced the integrated care systems and introduced more private involvement into the way the healthcare system itself is run. I wanted to ask you, going forward, and we are looking a little bit about the future now, and perhaps this is a message for one Mr. Burnham. What's the structural changes that the NHS needs in order to lock out privatisation for the long term?
the first message that I would say I would give to Andy Burnham is the NHS does not need any more restructuring, right? The idea of restructuring is always it always sounds interesting and promising in theory, right? The idea that more and more decisions about how care is provided should be made locally sounds very interesting. But the reality is that what we have is a national health service. That means whether you live in Newcastle or you live in Chelsea in London, you should be entitled to the same quality of care provided to the same level, free at the point of need at a publicly owned facility, right? And so the message to Andy Burnham is that should be the priority. The priority should be funding the NHS properly and beginning the process of reversing decades of privatization. Now, if we want to make some structural changes, there are two things that I think the government needs to make. Two changes that the government needs to make. The 2012 Act created actually not a 2012 Act, a 2006 Act created the divide between the provider and the commissioner, right? It used to be that the commissioner and the provider were exactly the same thing. And that was the NHS. The NHS commissioned and provided the care. Now, it seemed like an innocuous change when they broke those two things apart, right? So where the commissioner can be a separate thing and the provider can be a separate thing, and the provider became the trusts, and the commissioner became the what you might call the integrated care systems today, right? And that division then opened the door for the provider to begin to change character a little bit, right? It started off by being a publicly owned entity, such as an NHS trust, but increasingly now it can be a private company. And with West Streetings, to be fair to him, he wasn't the creator of it, but he has kind of put it on steroids. His choice agenda in the NHS, where if a patient shows up to the NHS, they should be provided with the choice of both NHS facilities and private facilities. With that choice agenda, what we are seeing is essentially an equating of the provision of care in an NHS facility. So there is just as much of a chance that the provider is going to be an NHS facility as there is that it's going to be a private company. So that is something that it would be really powerful if it changed. Kind of ending that division between the provider and the commissioner. And as I said earlier on, properly funding the NHS. The NHS used to be the best healthcare system in the world according to the Commonwealth Fund. It has kind of gone downhill somewhat since then. Part of the reason for that is obviously privatization, but a lot of the reason for that is underfunding. Research from the Health Foundation found that we spend about 40 billion pounds less on health per year than comparable countries like France and Germany. And up to a certain point, that doesn't really affect the quality of the care you provide, right? Because you might argue that some of that excess expenditure from France and Germany is inefficiencies because they have a weird system that involves some private insurance. But by the time you kind of begin to cut too close to the bone, it begins to affect the quality of care that people get. And that's what we're seeing with the NHS now. That's why we have 7 million people waiting for care that they urgently need, or a lot of them urgently need that they can't get. And obviously, you cannot fix this problem without properly funding the system. There is no way to fix this problem without funding the system properly. Rebuilding NHS hospitals, the 40 new hospital scheme, is really, really important. The governments keep using it as political football, but it's important. We need to rebuild hospitals, build new hospitals. Some of those older hospitals might need to be condemned entirely, but they need to be replaced by new hospitals. That investment kind of pays for itself in the long run, right? We have millions of people who can't participate in the economy today because they're off sick. Why do we think that is the case? The government, not just this one, but previous ones have been talking about productivity. You can't increase productivity when people are unwell and unable to work. So it's really important that we're investing at the right stage in order to bolster that productivity in the economy that everyone believes that we need. And I think it's fair to say we need to have in order to increase the quality of life of people across the United Kingdom.
So the last thing I wanted to ask you about healthcare before I move us on to the railways is a issue that you've been doing some campaigning work on, which is the deal that's being done around pharmaceuticals between Britain and the US.
Mm.
Could you talk us briefly through what that deal is and why you're concerned about it?
Yes, so the UK signed the deal, and as a lot of the viewers may remember, when Trump seemingly started dishing out tariffs to pretty much every country in the world that the US does business with some years ago. And after a bit of time, we heard that the UK was being exempt from some of those tariffs. And this deal that would, in effect, increase the amount of money that the NHS pays for the pharmaceutical drugs that it buys from American pharmaceutical companies was one of the sacrificial lambs that Keir Starmer and West Tweeting offered to the government, to the US government, in order to exempt the UK from some of those tariffs. And new research from researchers that published at the British Medical Journal showed that that deal would, in effect, redirect 45 billion pounds from the care of patients to, in many ways, the profits of US pharmaceutical giants. And their assessment is that this is going to lead to around 229,000 excess deaths. So deaths that would not have otherwise happened in England. Now, their research only looked at the effect on England, but I have been in a meeting with some of the authors of that research, and they said that although they did not kind of, the peer-reviewed analysis was not about Wales and Scotland, but they can say confidently that there would be some deaths as well in Wales and Scotland. So it affects people right across the United Kingdom, although the peer-reviewed analysis only deals with England. So we are essentially saying to Andy Burnham, you were not a part of this horrible deal, this deal that's going to cost lives. Um, you have an opportunity, just like we've heard murmurs of Andy Burnham coming in to say, we're no longer going to be dealing with Palantir and their software in the NHS. Now, they've rolled that back a little bit, but fingers crossed that they're able to kind of move forward in pushing Palantir out of the NHS. In the same way, they can come in and say, we did not make this deal. We don't agree to this deal. And somebody has called it, and it's on actually on the Parliament's website. It doesn't call it a deal or an agreement. It calls it an arrangement, which means maybe it's even softer than we thought it was, which means Andy Burnham can relatively easily kind of step out of it and say he's not going to abide by it. So we are essentially putting on an action in Parliament Square at 12 noon on Monday, the 13th of July, to have Andy Burnham, in effect, give Donald Trump the red card. And we're going to have somebody dressed as Andy Burnham with an Andy Burnham mask, give a red card to somebody dressed as Donald Trump with a Donald Trump mask, of course, to send a powerful message. Hopefully, you get some press coverage. Send a powerful message to Andy Burnham. The country is relying on you to do the right thing here. West Streeting and Keir Starmer failed to do the right thing. West Streeting received hundreds of thousands of pounds in donations from people with links to private healthcare. And obviously, I'm not accusing him of any impropriety, but the public would be. I don't think anybody would begrudge the public if they were worried somewhat about the motives behind some of these decisions, not just the trade deal one, but also, of course, the privatization of the NHS ones. So Andy Burnham has an opportunity to do the best thing, to start well by scrapping this deal.
I'm going to move us on from the NHS now because we've been going for half an hour already, and Joe Bosco and I could talk for hours and have done about how we fix the NHS and where we need to go. But I want to move us on to the Labour government's record on the railways, which is another key public service, and also another one where the government has talked up its successes. So since they came into office, Labour has introduced Great British Railways and started to take the rail franchises, the operators of the railways, into public ownership. What do you make of this as part of their programme, and is this something we should be celebrating?
Yes and no. I think I kind of suggested earlier on that the NHS is a unique area in the sense that it's an area where the government has done almost nothing good, right? So you might say maybe reducing the waiting list was something good, but in reality, a lot of that was just, I don't want to say cooking the books, but just rearranging how things are defined and moving things around. Um, Rail is an area where they've done some good things, but they continue to leave many good things undone. And as a matter of fact, in some of those areas, they continue to insist that they're not going to do those good things. So, as you may know, of course, Louis Haig, who had to leave government some years ago, was the one that put forward the railways public ownership bill that passed in 2024. And that bill, in effect, began the process of bringing the train operators into public ownership as their contracts end. Right, and perhaps I should start this by saying a little bit about how the railways actually work, right? Because we often talk about the railways, but it's not really. GBR is trying now to create the railways, but there's never really been such a thing as the railways. The trains themselves, the actual train carriages that we step on, and if you maybe somebody's on a train carriage right now being cooked by this heat, um, the actual train is not owned by the company that is running the trains on the track, right? The company that's running the train on the track is called a train operating company, a TOC, and it's different from the companies that own the trains. They're called the ROSCOs, the rolling stock companies. And that's different from the people that own the tracks and the train stations. And that is the state, the government. Network Rail owns the tracks and the train stations. Now, there are some train stations that are licensed to private companies to run, but that doesn't mean that they're owned by the private companies. They're owned by the state still. Now, you may remember, of course, that rail was privatized in 1994 by John Major, and he privatized everything. Even the tracks and everything was privatized. And we saw a bunch of accidents in the early 2000s and late 1990s that in effect made it unavoidable for for parts of the railway to be brought into public ownership. So Railtrack, which was the private company that owned the tracks after privatization, was taken into special administration and then permanently kept in public ownership. And the example of Railtrack is going to become somewhat relevant later on, hopefully if we talk about Thames Water. But Railtrack was kept in public ownership and renamed to Network Rail, and it remains in public ownership today. And we've not had those kinds of accidents since anymore. So that's one bit of it. Now the government is bringing in the operation of the trains, the TOCs, the TOCs, as they call them in the industry, into public ownership. So the government is going to be running the trains now as contracts come into end. And you might remember that very recently, a few months ago, the biggest private train operator, Govia Thameslink, was brought into public ownership. Now, the government is saying that the Roscoes will not be brought into public ownership. The Roscoes are by far the most profitable part of the railway system. They make around 400 million pounds in profits, or they pay out around 400 million pounds in dividends to their shareholders every single year. Now, we actually did some research working with the office of Chris Hinchcliffe, or his Hinchcliffe MP, a few months ago, that found that if the government had brought rolling stock into public ownership in 2023 or 2022, so essentially after the pandemic, between the end of the pandemic and today, and reinvested all of these dividends that are currently going out into the pockets of private shareholders, into cutting rail fares, our rail fares would be at least 13% lower today than they are, right? 13% doesn't sound like a lot, but it makes a difference in an economy in which people are spending around 9-10% of their income on transport costs, right? So during a cost of living crisis, that can make a difference. So in effect, the government should be, and we've said to them, we're not expecting you to do this all in one go. We realize it could be quite expensive. You can do the same thing you're doing with the train operating companies for the rolling stock companies. They also have contracts with the railway. You should bring the rolling stock into public ownership as the contracts end. And the government has continued to refuse to do that. And that is something that the railways bill is not going to do for passengers. Now, we've also demanded that the government should give passengers a real say in how the railways run, right? We don't believe in the model of public ownership that has, mandarins in Whitehall running public ownership as though they were some type of benevolent dictators for the public. We believe in a model of running public ownership that sees households, public service users, experts, small businesses that rely on those public services part and parcel of kind of running that service, right? So we have been saying to the government, you need to create a passenger voice within the railway system, bringing together passengers, disability groups, people that rely on the railway system across the board, bringing them into the decision-making process of GBR at board level. And the government is refusing to do that. And that's something that we're hoping that the House of Lords is going to pick up on now that the bill is in the House of Lords. And lastly, something that I wanted to mention as well is that there's going to, despite the government bringing rail into public ownership, and I mentioned this earlier on very briefly, in a number of the stations that we have across the country, railway stations, a lot of the services in those stations are currently outsourced. The cleaners, the security staff, and all sorts of other staff at these stations are outsourced. And we've been working with the rail union RMT on their campaign to bring those workers back into in-house so that they're providing a service and their pay and conditions are commensurate with the standard across the industry and not being outsourced so that they can be paid less and their conditions undermined. So those are areas that the government is currently failing the public, failing workers, failing the railway system. And we're saying to them, you can't give the public 20% of what the public wants and claim that you've given them 100% of what they want, which is what the government is currently doing. And you're allowing private companies to continue to extract hundreds of millions of pounds in dividends from providing services in the railway sector. You have to do the right thing. Give the railway all the tools it needs to survive, or to do the job well, because if it doesn't, the public is going to think that what has failed was public ownership. And that's a big risk for the government. And it's a big risk for anybody who believes that our public services should be run for people and not profit. Because the government would, in effect, have set up public ownership to be seen as a failure. And we absolutely cannot accept that. That's why we are putting pressure on the government, and we put pressure on the government when the bill was in the Commons, and we know that a lot of allies that we're working with are continuing to do so in the House of Lords.
So I wanted to ask you something in relation to one of the things that you mentioned there, which is around the model of public ownership that the government has adopted when it comes to Great British Railways and the bringing of the rail operators into public hands. So for viewers who might be new to all this, essentially the model of public ownership that was adopted sort of mostly by the Attlee government, which did a lot of the nationalisation of some sectors and industries after the Second World War, was what's typically referred to as the Morrisonian model in reference to the Labour minister who oversaw a lot of it. And essentially, what that meant was that you'd have like the National Coal Board would be a group of people who were in some instances the people that were running the coal industry when it was in private hands, they're responsible for overseeing it, and it's sort of run arm's length from the government, but it's essentially a publicly owned company. What you're talking about, John Bosco, is a much deeper form of public ownership where there's, I guess, involvement from passenger groups and other stakeholders in the overseeing of the in this instance the railway. Why is it, do you think, that the government has basically opted for essentially the old school Morrisonian model of public ownership rather than a sort of more participatory democratic model? Is it ideological? Are they worried about losing control over things? Do they not trust the public to be involved in the running of their services? What do you think is at the crux of that?
I don't think that they don't trust the public necessarily. I think that what they're worried about is what pretty much every government is worried about, but it is the reason why public participation is important. They're worried about essentially losing control of the narrative, right? At the moment, GBR is going to be an arm's length body, so it's not going to be a government body necessarily. That is, it's a kind of an arm's length company owned by the government. That means it's not run day to day by the government. And the idea is that it has a board, and the board is going to make its day to day decisions. And having passengers on those boards makes it really difficult for, let's say, Chris, you are a rail expert. You've run private rail companies in the past. And the government, because it's the Secretary of State that's going to choose the chair of the GBR board, right? The government selects you to be the chair of the GBR board. And the government says to you, in 2027, we have only 11 billion pounds to put into the railways as subsidies. Now, it's your job to make it work, right? You don't, your job does not involve putting pressure on the government to increase the amount of investment in the railways, because obviously investment in the railways serves the entire economy. For every £1 we put in the railways, generate £2.5 of extra economic activity in the railways. Your job as the chair of GBR board is not to put pressure on the government. It's to make the money you've been given work. But if you had passengers on the board, they're not going to be playing politics with the government, right? Passengers are going to be saying, here is what we need, here is what passengers need in the railways. And they're going to put pressure, but privately, because they're going to have access to a lot of this information that they need for action, but also publicly to say to the government, this is not enough. We need more. We need you to do X, Y, and Z thing to make the railway more accessible for disabled people, to make the railway serve local businesses in small communities. And it's really, really important that this voice is on the table. And I think that the government is afraid of losing the narrative, so to speak, by having these really important voices on at the table. And in some ways, I think it's kind of missing a trick, because in reality, if you have these voices on the table and they buy into the things that you are doing, that increases your chances of actually being able to kind of generate public support for the reforms that you're doing in the sector. So they should be seeing it as an opportunity instead of seeing it as a potential danger. And I think that's why they're not doing it. But absolutely, they have to be doing it, because 21st century public ownership, as we've seen with in other countries, Paris, for example, created the Paris Water Observatory when they took their water into public ownership. It brought together households and experts. And what did we see after that? Satisfaction in their water sector increased significantly. They cleaned up the River Seine as a result of that, right? Those are things that we see public participation can deliver for public services, and the government absolutely has to do it.
So you're segueing us beautifully there onto the water sector, and I am going to move us onto that given we don't have huge amounts of time left. So water obviously is an essential for life. It's something that has been a major political issue over recent years, with not least the impending collapse of Thames Water, the state of our rivers and seas, with water companies dumping raw sewage into them, and with ever rising bills. What's gone wrong with the water sector, and what's the answer?
Well, I suppose the question is what has not gone wrong with the water sector? But I'm going to highlight just a few things that have gone wrong with the water sector. Water was privatized in 1989, All of the water companies had £0 and 0 pence in debt when they were privatized. The government made it a point to privatize them without debt. Now, in the entirety of the water sector, they now hold upwards of £80 billion in debt. Thames Water specifically holds about £20 billion in debt. Over the period of privatization, they've taken out almost £90 billion in dividends for their shareholders. Thames Water specifically, as of 2023, has taken out around 10.4 billion in dividends. And I say 2023 partly because from 2024, Thames Water has been in crisis and on the brink of collapse. So we don't really know what the figures are since then, but it's possible that more has gone out over that period. I wouldn't put that past Thames Water, but we know for sure that they've taken out at least £10 billion since privatization in dividends. Now, as you mentioned, of course, the dumping sewage in our rivers and seas. Um, Last year, they dumped around 1.8 million hours worth of sewage in the rivers and seas. And not only are they dumping sewage in our rivers and seas, they're also not investing in the infrastructure. And obviously, those two things are related, right? Because they're dumping sewage because they've not invested in the infrastructure to prevent them from dumping sewage. And part of the impact of not investing in the infrastructure then is that they're allowing around 3 billion liters of water to leak out across England. And that has an impact on days like this, right? When we're reminded of the fact that the Environment Agency is predicting that parts of England would be in drought by 2050, right? So what is really, really important as well to keep in mind is that not only have they been not investing in the infrastructure, they've been selling off a lot of the infrastructure, right? They've sold off around 35 reservoirs since 2017, and they've not built many new ones. As from what I know, when I prepared to give a talk on this a few weeks ago, um, the research I did then suggested that they have about 17 applications for new reservoirs. So they're not even replacing the ones that they built, the ones that they sold with new ones. And we don't know when those applications are going to be approved, if they're going to be approved, right? So that's what has gone wrong with the with the water sector. What we have seen private interests being put above the public interest for in a public service that is the stuff of life, right? If water is not being run in the public interest, something that we would all die if we did not have, if that is not being run in the public interest, in some ways, that's the canary in the coal mine for the entirety of the public services. And that's what has gone wrong with our water industry. And I think the public is fed up. The public has had enough of it, right? Polling overwhelmingly shows, the latest polling shows that 83% of the public, huge majorities of every kind of voter, right? Regardless of the party they voted for, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, regardless of their age, regardless of what region of England they live in, um, they want water to be in public hands. And water in public hands is not radical. 90% of countries in the world run their water in public hands. Scotland, here in the United Kingdom, runs its water in public hands, and as a result, their rivers are not perfect, but they're cleaner than our rivers here in England because they're able to invest about 20 or 30% more per household into the infrastructure than we are able to do here in England. Right. So it's really, really important that our water is being brought into public ownership. And I think Thames Water is low-hanging fruit for Andy Burnham. As soon as he becomes Prime Minister, he should put an end to the crisis at Thames Water by bringing it into public ownership.
So, my final question for you on water before we move on to Mr. Burnham is in this whole conversation, we've been talking about public ownership. One of the things that the government consistently says around public ownership is, well, that might be all well and good, but the price tag is too much. And there is nowhere that they say that more than in the water industry, where there is huge public pressure for public ownership. So, why is the government wrong that the costs of taking the water sector into public ownership is too expensive?
The government is wrong because their figures are wrong. They have been claiming, for example, that it would cost £100 billion to nationalize the water industry. They've not told us where they got those figures from. Um, the expectation is that they're based on an analysis that was commissioned by the water companies themselves. That was carried out by I've forgotten what the company is called. That said that it would cost about 90 billion pounds to nationalize the water industry. Now let's take Thames Water out of the water industry. Let's take it as an example of the kind of, forgive the language, the stupidity of this analysis. This analysis says that Thames Water is worth 20 billion pounds. Now, KKR, which is a US private equity company, refused to pay 4 billion pounds for Thames Water a few months ago. Right? Thames Water is in crisis. It needs a new company to take it over. Well, it needs to be brought into public ownership, but the government wants to exhaust all of its private options. And KKR, which is a company that has given the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, more than £20,000 in donations, expressed an interest in buying Thames Water. They looked at everything. They refused to buy it for 4 billion pounds. How can you be worth 20 billion pounds if nobody will buy you for 4 billion pounds? Right? So that's ridiculous to begin with. But something we also know is that the value of these water companies is not what the water companies say it is, right? There is a ruling from the 1980s, Lithgow versus the US at the European Court of Human Rights, that suggested that the capital value of these companies, which is what the government's estimate is based on, is not what you have to pay when you're buying a public service like a water company. What you have to pay is what they call the appropriate value. And Commonwealth, the think tank Commonwealth, and Barry Gardner himself said the same in Parliament a few weeks ago, that the value of a lot of these water companies could be as low as £0 and 0 pence in terms of their appropriate value. Why? Because the appropriate value takes into account how much you've taken out in dividends over the period of that you've owned it, and how much you failed to invest in the infrastructure. In effect, how much the government would then have to put into investing in the infrastructure for that company after it buys it because you failed to invest in that infrastructure. And for a lot of these companies, it might even end up being the case that the private companies need to pay us some money. But at the very least, just to sound reasonable, it could be as low as £0 and 0 pence in terms of paying to buy the company itself. Now, of course, these companies still have debt. Thames Water has about 20 billion pounds in debt. And we can't just erase debt willy-nilly. But the reality is that the government itself, the conservative government before the last general election, had actually already war gamed what would happen if they needed to take Thames Water into public ownership. They called it Project Timber. And Project Timber actually estimated that they could very easily force the private companies who hold Thames Water's debt to take about a 40% haircut on that debt. Now, JP Morgan, which is obviously the investment bank, estimates that it could be as high as 55% haircut on that debt, right? So the government could, in effect, be saving around 10 to 11 or around 8 to 10 billion pounds in the debt that Thames Water currently holds by renegotiating that deal and then paying the rest back after, on the basis of public lending or public credit rates, not the private credit rates that are far higher than they are. At the end of the day, it could cost as little as 0.4% of the current national debt to take Thames Water into public ownership. And we know that in the long term, it pays for itself, both in the form of what we save in interest rates, but also what we save in dividends that would have already otherwise gone out that would then not be going out.
So we've got a few minutes left, and I've been promising to talk a little bit about Andy Burnham, who looms large over all conversations around the future of British politics, the economy, and so on at the moment. So throughout the sort of last few weeks since Andy Burnham was involved in the Makerfield by-election and then was elected to Parliament, he's been talking a lot about something that he describes as public control. Now, if you would listen to some of the media reporting on this, you would think that he's intending to nationalize the entire economy, which I think it's fair to say he's not. What is the difference between public control and public ownership?
I think that's a really, really important question and important for people to kind of pay attention to. A very good example of how to illustrate the difference between public ownership and public control is something that we own it, and our campaigner in Greater Manchester, Pascal Robinson, some years ago, and you remember this, Chris, because he used to work at We Own It, and you know this firsthand. Um, we actually got Andy Burnham to bring Greater Manchester buses into public control. Now, we did that as public control is a step in terms of being better than the kind of jungle that they had in Greater Manchester, but it's not the end of the road, right? Public control essentially says, we tell you the routes that you're going to run, we tell you how much you're going to charge for bus fares, we tell you the times that you're going to run the service, but the buses still belong to the private sector, and they still hire the bus drivers and they run the service in effect, right? So it's still a privatized service, but the government kind of exercises immense control over how that service is run. And I think Greater Manchester buses is a good example because the private companies, First Group and Stagecoach, are still making millions of pounds from running buses in Greater Manchester, tens of millions of pounds, in fact, per year from running Greater Manchester's buses. That is money that could be put back into cutting fares for local people, into investing in training and hiring new bus drivers so that they're able to serve the community better. That is not able to be done right now because profits are still going out of the system. And that's fundamentally the difference between public control and public ownership. Under public ownership, we own the service in its entirety. We own the A very good example of a service that's in public ownership is the NHS, right? We own the hospitals. We own the equipment within the hospitals. We hire the doctors and the nurses in the hospitals. We decide how those services will be run in the hospitals. A good example of a service that's in um, in public control, which is going to be very interesting to people because Andy Burnham has been saying he's going to bring in public control of water and energy and all of those other things. A good example of a service that's in public control is actually water, right? Because we tell them how they're going to deliver the service. We tell them that they have to deliver the service to every household in England. We tell them how much they can charge or they can't, by how much they can't increase people's water bills. We set the limit every 5 years, I believe, or every couple of years. We essentially control how that service is provided, but it's still a privately owned service. Thames Water is still a private company. They still extracted more than £10 billion in dividends from the service since privatization, but it's under public control. So people should not allow themselves to be got, so to speak, by the narrative of saying public control. But what the public is demanding, what the public needs, and what's going to deliver the improvements that the public is demanding is public ownership. The service owned, controlled, and run by the public in the public interest.
So there is so much more that we could talk about, but we have used up our hour. Very, very briefly before I let you run off, John Bosco, I wanted to just ask how people can get involved with We Own It and hear more about what you do.
Absolutely. So if you want to get involved with We On It and receive our newsletters, we send out one or two newsletters every week, so we don't bombard your inbox. And each newsletter comes with a clear, specific, simple action that you can take to help um, stop privatization or advance the cause of public ownership of our public services. Go to weownit.org.uk to sign on to our email list. You go to get involved, the tab on the website, get involved to join our email list and get involved. We campaigned successfully for public ownership of rail that the government is delivering. We campaigned successfully to stop the government from privatizing Channel 4 a few years ago. We campaigned successfully for Andy Burnham to bring Greater Manchester's buses into public ownership. And we continue to campaign successfully on a whole bunch of fronts today. And we're asking people, if you can, do join our email list, get involved in the work we do, and help fight for public services that work for us and not for private shareholders scattered all the way around the world.